Most ranger reports never leave the district office. They sit in binders, written plainly, without interpretation, describing things that don't fit cleanly into any category. The following account is one of those entries, recorded during a late-season assignment in a remote section of federal land. I was filling in on a temporary rotation at a backcountry ranger cabin in the northern section of the Teton Range, late September, right after the last wave of permitted campers had thinned out and before the first real snow made the service roads unreliable, and most of my shift was routine enough to feel like background noise, checking the permit board twice a day, logging radio contact at the top of every hour, walking the short loop trail behind the cabin to make sure no one had slipped past the seasonal closure signs. But the first thing that didn't line up was a truck I logged on my second morning, parked just beyond the cattle gate on a maintenance road that wasn't listed on any visitor map and wasn't supposed to be accessible without a district key, and I remember standing there longer than necessary, looking at the tires, because the dust pattern was wrong, like it had been driven in during the night, after a light wind had already settled the road, which meant someone knew exactly when to come through without leaving a clear track. And that kind of awareness usually belongs to staff or locals, not random visitors. So I checked the glove box for the laminated closure notice we sometimes leave on windshields, but there wasn't one on that truck. No note, no tag, just an empty cab and a faint smell of something chemical when I leaned closer. Not fuel exactly, more like solvent. And I wrote the plate number down in my field notebook even though I already knew dispatch wouldn't be able to run it until my evening radio window when signal bounced better off the ridge. And I went back to the cabin with that detail sitting in the back of my head while I did the usual tasks, tested the generator by the shed, cleared a fallen branch from the trailhead sign, updated the weather board with a colder forecast coming in from the west, and around mid-afternoon, while I was inside checking the old radio console, I heard a transmission break through on the second channel we almost never use out there. Just a short burst, not even a full sentence, something like, "Copy that. He's still at the station." And I remember pausing with my hand still on the volume dial because nobody had checked in with me on that channel all day, and protocol says you identify yourself immediately if you hear your location referenced. But I didn't, not right away, because the voice didn't match anyone in our district, and the tone wasn't official. It sounded like someone trying to sound official without knowing the rhythm of it. And by the time I keyed the mic and called out, there was only static and the low hum of the generator outside carrying through the floorboards. So I logged it as interference, even though interference doesn't usually form words that cleanly. And I told myself I'd bring it up during the scheduled check-in at 1800. But the rest of the afternoon started to layer in small things that didn't sit right, like the back door of the equipment shed not closing flush the way it had that morning, the latch catching halfway like it had been tested from the outside, and a set of footprints near the water spigot that didn't match my boots, narrower, deeper at the heel, leading toward the tree line, and then just ending where the ground turned to pine needles, which happens, sure. But usually, there's some continuation if you look long enough, and I did look longer than I should have. Long enough for the light to start flattening out across the clearing, and for the usual bird noise to drop off earlier than expected. And I remember noticing that because part of our routine is noting wildlife activity for seasonal patterns, and that silence felt out of place for that hour. So I circled back toward the cabin, double-checked the front lock even though I hadn't left it open, and tried the radio again, switching between channels to see if I could pick up anything clearer. But it was mostly dead air until just before my scheduled contact window, when the signal sharpened enough for dispatch to come through, and I reported the truck, the partial transmission, and the footprints, keeping it straightforward. No speculation, just facts. And the dispatcher acknowledged it but didn't sound concerned, said they'd log the plate when the system refreshed, and asked if I felt unsafe, which is a standard question. And I said no, not exactly, because at that point it wasn't a clear threat, just a series of details that didn't align. And after that call, the temperature dropped faster than the forecast had suggested. Enough that I could see my breath when I stepped out onto the porch to check the perimeter one more time before dark. And that's when I noticed the truck again. except it wasn't where I'd seen it that morning. It had been moved about 30 yards closer to the cabin, angled slightly toward the service road like it was preparing to leave, and I know I would have heard an engine if it had been moved recently because sound carries in that valley, especially in the cold, but I hadn't heard anything, not even the crunch of tires on gravel. So I walked halfway toward it, stopped, and listened, the way you do when you're trying to separate natural sounds from something deliberate, and there was nothing, except the wind starting to come down off the ridge in short, uneven pushes, and I didn't go all the way to the truck that time, which is something I still think about, because part of the job is to make contact, to identify, to resolve, but something about the angle of it, the way it had been repositioned without any clear movement, made it feel less like a parked vehicle and more like a marker, like it was being used to measure distance or line of sight. And I went back inside, locked both doors, and wrote everything down in the logbook in as much detail as I could manage while it was still fresh, including the timestamps, the weather shift, the radio anomaly, because if something escalates later, those small details matter. And around 2100, well after full dark, the radio came alive again on that secondary channel, clearer this time, and I heard the same voice, or at least I think it was the same, say, "He didn't leave," followed by a pause, and then, "Wait until lights out." And I didn't respond, not because I didn't want to, but because I realized in that moment that whoever was transmitting wasn't trying to reach me. They were coordinating around me, assuming I wasn't listening on that frequency, and I shut the radio off after logging the exact phrasing, which goes against protocol, but I needed the silence to think. And I turned off the interior lights one by one, leaving only the small lamp near the desk so the cabin wouldn't glow like a marker in the clearing. And I sat there for a long time with the generator humming outside and the wind pressing intermittently against the walls, trying to decide whether to stay put until morning or make the drive out while I still had a clear road. And in the end I stayed, mostly because the truck's position would have forced me to pass it at close range on that first. The way out, and I didn't want to do that in the dark without knowing who I was dealing with, so I waited, and sometime after midnight, when the temperature had dropped enough to frost the inside edges of the window glass, I heard a sound that wasn't loud but didn't belong, a soft metallic shift from the direction of the shed, like a tool being set down or picked up carefully. And I stood there in the dark, not moving, counting seconds between the wind gusts to see if it repeated. And it did. Once. Then nothing, and I didn't go out to check, which, again, isn't what training pushes you toward. But there's a difference between responding to a clear situation and stepping into something that's being staged. And by morning the truck was gone, no tracks leading out on the road where I expected them. Just a faint disturbance in the dust near where it had been, like it had been rolled a short distance, and then something else. I don't have a better way to describe it. And when I opened the shed to check for missing equipment, everything was accounted for except one item I hadn't thought to log the day before, a spare handheld radio. Older model, usually kept on the back shelf, and I only realized it was missing because in its place, set neatly where it would have been, was a folded piece of paper taken from our own logbook, with a single line written in the same format we use for time entries, except the time was from earlier that morning, before sunrise, and the note read, "Station checked. Occupied as expected." By the time I took the winter contact assignment at a Desert Ranger outpost in the eastern edge of Death Valley, I'd already done enough backcountry work to know that isolation changes how people behave. But I hadn't spent much time dealing with it in a place where the landscape itself removes your sense of scale, and that outpost sat alone at the end of a graded road that drifted over with sand every few days. Just a low concrete structure with a solar array, a radio mast, and a shaded permit board bolted into the ground. And my job through January was mostly administrative, logging the occasional off-season visitor, checking the emergency water cache, relaying weather and closure updates when the signal allowed. But the situation started with something procedural, not dramatic. A discrepancy in the permit board, where 3 overnight backcountry permits had been filled out in the same handwriting on different days, all listing different trail routes that didn't connect in any practical way. And I noticed it because the handwriting was too consistent. Same pressure on the pen, same slight tilt on the numbers. And people don't usually write like that unless they're copying something or filling out multiple forms at once. So I pulled the stubs and checked the dates against the log I kept inside, and none of those names had come through my station, which meant they either bypassed me entirely or someone was filling out permits without intending to follow them. And I remember holding those slips up to the light coming through the doorway and seeing faint impressions from previous pages, like the person had been pressing hard enough to leave a trace across multiple forms. And for a moment I considered it a harmless oddity, maybe a group planning routes in advance, but the dates didn't line up with any expected traffic, and the temperatures at night had been dropping below freezing, which discourages casual exploration, so I logged it as an irregularity and moved on with my routine, checking the solar charge levels, sweeping sand out from the threshold, doing a radio check at noon that barely connected due to atmospheric interference that always got worse in the afternoon heat. And it wasn't until later, when I stepped out to inspect the water cache tanks, that I saw a figure standing near the far edge of the access road, just at the point where the land dips and the heat shimmer distorts outlines. And at first I thought it was a trick of the light, because the person wasn't moving in a way that matched the wind or the terrain, just standing there, facing in my direction, and I raised a hand out of habit. The standard gesture to signal acknowledgement, but there was no response, no wave back, no step forward, just that stillness. And after a few seconds I walked a little closer, not all the way, keeping the outpost within a short distance behind me, and called out something simple like, "You need assistance?" Which is what we're trained to say, neutral, non-assuming, but the voice that came back didn't answer the question. It just said, "You're open year-round?" in a flat tone that didn't quite match the situation, and I said yes, limited services, and asked if they had a permit, and there was a pause long enough that I started to think I hadn't been heard, and then the person said, "I filled one out already," and I remember that detail catching my attention immediately because of the earlier discrepancy, and I asked which route they were taking, and they named one of the routes from those forms, but mispronounced it in a way that suggested they'd read it rather than heard it spoken, and I told them that area was restricted due to seasonal hazards, and asked if they had a map, and they said, "I've got what I need," and then turned and walked away without any of the usual follow-up questions people have, like distance or water availability, just turned and moved down the slope where there isn't an established trail. And I watched longer than I should have, partly because I was trying to track their direction, and partly because something about the interaction felt incomplete, like a conversation cut short before it actually started. And when I went back inside, I checked the permit stubs again, comparing the handwriting to what I could remember of the way they spoke, which doesn't make logical sense, but felt connected at the time, and I noticed that all 3 permits listed different emergency contact numbers, but the area codes were the same, not local to the park, but clustered from a different state entirely. And I wrote those down too, intending to pass them along during the evening radio window. But that's when the communication issue started to shift, because the radio, which had been unreliable but functional, began picking up intermittent signals that overlapped with my attempts to reach dispatch, short bursts of static, layered with fragments of speech that didn't resolve into full sentences, except for one repeated phrase that came through twice within an hour, "Hold position," spoken in a tone that sounded practiced but not quite professional, like someone imitating that they thought an initial command should sound like, "Barrow, ba, what?" And each time it cut off before I could triangulate direction or respond, and I tried switching frequencies, adjusting the antenna angle, even stepping outside to see if the signal improved away from the structure, but it didn't stabilize. And by late afternoon, the wind picked up, pushing fine sand across the road in thin sheets that erased smaller tracks almost as soon as they formed. And I remember thinking that if someone was moving out there, they could disappear from sight in a matter of minutes without leaving much trace. which made the earlier encounter feel less like a coincidence and more like a controlled approach. And as the light started to drop, I did a perimeter check, noting the position of the vehicles in the small lot, just my service truck. No others, and the condition of the access road, which showed faint tire marks that didn't match my own. Running parallel for a short distance before veering off toward a section of open desert where there's no reason to drive unless you know exactly where you're going. And I followed those marks on foot for a few yards until the wind blurred them into nothing, and when I turned back, I saw that the permit bore had been disturbed, one of the forms missing from the stack. And for a second I thought I'd miscounted earlier, but the remaining forms were slightly shifted, like someone had flipped through them quickly. And that's when the time pressure set in, because once the sun drops behind those low ridges, the temperature falls fast, and visibility changes in a way that makes distance harder to judge, and I needed to decide whether to stay put and continue logging, or secure the outpost and report in from a safer location. But before I made that call, the radio cleared just enough for a clean transmission to come through on the primary channel, and it wasn't dispatch. It was a voice I hadn't heard before saying, "Confirming you're still at the contact station," and I responded automatically, identifying myself and asking them to repeat their call sign. And there was a brief delay, just long enough to feel deliberate. And then the voice replied with a call sign that was almost correct, one digit off from our district format, and I said, "That's not a valid identifier, who is this?" And the line went quiet again. No static, no carrier tone, just silence. And I stood there with the mic in my hand, aware of how exposed the outpost was in every direction. And I made the decision to secure the building. Shut down non-essential systems, and prepare to leave at first light rather than risk navigating the access road in the dark with unknown activity in the area. So I locked the exterior panels, brought the remaining permit forms inside, and set the radio to scan mode at low volume. And sometime during the night, while the wind moved steadily across the flat ground and the solar panels creaked slightly with the temperature shift, I noticed a faint glow on the horizon that didn't match any known road or settlement, too low and too steady to be aircraft, and it held there for a long time without moving closer or farther, just a fixed point of light in a place where there shouldn't have been anything. And I watched it until my eyes started to strain, then forced myself to step away and get some rest. Because fatigue makes everything feel more intentional than it is, and when morning came, the light was gone, the wind had settled, and the access road looked as if it hadn't been used at all overnight. Smooth in a way that suggested either no traffic or very careful movement. And before I left, I did one last check of the permit board area and found a new form placed on top of the stack, filled out in the same handwriting as the others. Dated for that morning, listing no route at all, just a blank line where the destination should be, and under number of people, it said 1 confirmed, which isn't how anyone fills that out, and the emergency contact field, instead of a phone number, had my station's radio frequency written down, exactly as it appears on the laminated chart inside the outpost, a chart that had been on the wall behind me the entire time.